Today, we're going to talk about some of the barriers in access to higher education, specifically for those who are part of minority racial groups and from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. I'd like to start by showing this graph, which shows a percentage of different racial groups' access and enrollment in college. While there's a large disparity between, say, Asian and Indigenous students, enrollments for mixed white and Latina students and Black students are actually pretty close. And I mention this because it's important to acknowledge that this has not always been the case. As recently as the 1970s, only about 15% of Black students were enrolled in college, compared to about 33% for white students. So clearly, a lot of progress has been made. And I think that it's important to prepare ourselves to tackle today's issues and the issues of the future. It is important that we look at the initiatives of the modern past. Since the beginning of our country's history, race has been inextricably linked to injustice and inequity, and this is especially true in our education system. Native American students were subject to boarding schools with the intent of assimilating them into white culture. In California in the 1800s, Chinese American students were routinely denied access to public schooling, and Latino students were often excluded from different educational opportunities. And in the American South in the same time period, there were laws that made it illegal to even teach Black people to read and write. When there were initiatives to educate racial minorities, it was often with the intention of imparting white behaviors, values, and beliefs. When slavery was abolished in 1865, Black children were supposedly given the same rights as white children, but Jim Crow laws held that these schools be maintained separate but equal. And more often than not, these schools were anything but equal, lacking in quality and funding and even availability. This phenomenon still persists today, although not as outright law. According to the, oh my gosh, according to the essay Inequality in Teaching and Schooling by Linda Darling Hammond, the wealthiest 10% of school districts in the United States spend nearly 10 times more than the poorest 10%, and spending ratios of 3 to 1 are common within states. Furthermore, poor and minority students are concentrated in the least well-funded schools, most of which are located in central cities or rural areas and funded at levels substantially below those of neighboring suburban districts. I point this out because it is easy to say that, or to look at that graph that shows the almost equal levels of enrollment in college of today's white and black students, and say that we maybe have achieved equality. But there are quite a number of social barriers for minority students to higher education, and as you can see, they often have their roots in these historical issues. Another social barrier preventing access to higher education is what we call the school to prison pipeline, which refers to the school disciplinary actions that funnel youth out of this classroom and into the legal system. This can be caused by a couple different things, maybe an unwarranted suspensions, lack of counseling resources, or even an over-reliance on school police officers. But the effect is the same. An alarming amount of students of color are pushed out of our education system at too young of an age. According to the ACLU, over the 2017-2018 school year, Black students accounted for 31% of all the students arrested at school, despite representing just 15% of the total enrolled student population. Even a single disciplinary infraction can have enormous consequences on a person's life, and they tend to escalate quickly. Unfortunately, this reflects on our society's priority for incarceration over education. And even if you can overcome these barriers, you can stay on track throughout school and you study hard, and maybe even though you don't have access to the right classes, minority students are at a huge disadvantage in being able to pay for school. In this graph, we can see that the average unmet need of the student, you can see the average unmet need of minority students is far higher, and they're going to be left with far more debt after graduating. And I say this to highlight that these are really complicated issues. It isn't enough to say that Black and white students are now enrolling in college at essentially the same rates, because those Black students are having to overcome a lot more barriers to get there. And even when they do make it there, they're graduating at rates much lower than their white counterparts. Again, these are complicated issues, and issues that have been ingrained in our culture for a very long time. But just because they have been part of our past does not mean that they have to be part of our future. Thank you for your time. Here are my sources.